Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Welcome to the show. And do we even need an introduction for today's guest? I don't think we do, but here we go anyway. In a worldwide poll conducted by ESPN in, I think it was 2012, Mark Allen was voted the greatest endurance athlete of all time. He won the Hawaiian Ironman World Championship 6 times and was the first ever ITU Olympian distance world champion in 1989 in France. And the list goes on. Amongst guest speaking, consulting, running sport and spirit workshops, writing books and surfing, today Mark is sharing his wealth of knowledge and experience in training other athletes at MarkAllenCoaching. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ali. Great to be on.
So your career lasted an amazing 15 years, I believe. And what amazed me was you seemed just to get better every year. You won the Hawaiian Ironman at the age of 37, which was unbelievable. So just want to know your secret, Mark.
Well, it wasn't really any secret. When I started out in the sport, there was very little information on how to train for triathlon. There were no triathlon coaches for sure because the sport was young. It was in 1982. And so when I got into it, I sort of came into it with the training techniques of being an ex-swimmer, which at that time meant, you just went hard every workout. And that did not translate very well to cycling and definitely not to running because right away I saw that I was getting injured a lot and it just wasn't working. I was getting tired a lot. I could race well, but then I'd be exhausted. And I thought there has to be a better way. And so I think it was about just barely 2 years into my career, I connected with Phil Maffetone, who was doing a lot of groundbreaking work using heart rate to regulate training intensities. And he took me to a running track and said, run a mile at 155 beats a minute and let's see what your pace is. And I thought, okay, at that point in my career in short races, I was trying to hit close to a 5-minute mile pace, which was kind of what the fastest guys were holding in Olympic distance races for their 10K. And I thought I had to do that in every workout. Otherwise, I'm never going to be able to be competitive with these guys. And so when I timed that mile on the track, it was almost closer to a 9-minute mile to keep my heart rate from skyrocketing over 155 beats a minute. And I thought, geez, so what does he want me to do with this? 8.5, 9-minute mile, that's not even fast enough to beat guys twice my age. I was about 25 at the time. He said, this is what you're going to have to do to train your aerobic system, your endurance engine that you need for triathlon. Triathlon is an endurance sport, first and foremost. Of course, you need some speed. But so then I just basically kept all my workouts at 155 beats a minute or less for a few months. Went to a race at the very end of that season on the island of Kauai, which is another one of the Hawaiian Islands, and had one of the strongest races I'd ever had. And I thought, maybe there is something to this. And so it's a long way of getting around to answering your question of how did I last so long and get better as I went? Well, I just trained smart. I did not overdo the intensity. Human beings are not put together to go hard all the time. We're endurance animals. We have this incredible capacity to develop our aerobic fat burning system. Our speed system, that anaerobic part, is just a small part of our physiology. And so I worked on developing that aerobic system. Aerobic training is low stress on the body. Anaerobic training, high intensity work, is high stress on the body. So over the course of my career, the bulk of my workouts were actually low stress, even though I did a lot of training. I took long off seasons, which were key for really putting the energy back in after a long season of training and racing pretty hard. So from the end of October, middle of October, whenever Ironman was, until basically January 1st, I didn't do anything structured. I would just go out and run easy when I felt like running a few days a week, maybe get on my bike once a week, surfed a lot. I stayed active, but I wasn't training and I was sort of just recharging. Most guys would take 3 weeks off. I took, 2.5 months, very easy, unstructured. And then kind of the last piece on that was that I also didn't race as much as most guys. I would race around 7 or 8 times a year. And that included basically one Ironman, sometimes two in a season. A lot of years, Denise Triathlon, which was about a 6-hour race, and then a couple half Ironman distance races, and then the rest were Olympic distance. Most of the guys I was competing against were competing, 12 to 15 times a year. That's a big ask on your body, especially if you're doing a lot of those races are Ironman distance. So it's kind of a long way of saying I trained smart. I took good off seasons. I didn't overstress my body, and I didn't over race. And the combination ended up bringing me a long career, 15 years in each year, because I was just gradually building my fitness on a deep level. I was able to basically get better all of those 15 years.
Wow, it's amazing. So how did it make you feel when you met Phil Maffetone and he's like, slow down?
Well, at first I thought, this guy's nuts, crazy. How can you get faster by slowing down? And a number of years after I finished competing, Brant Secunda, who I have studied shamanism with since about 1990, he and I wrote a book together called Fit Soul, Fit Body, 9 Keys to a Healthier, Happier You. And one of the keys in there is slow down to get faster. And that was based on what I did in my training. Phil kind of explained it. He said, we have all this fat in our body. We could go 500 miles on stored fat if we could use it all, but we only have enough carbohydrate to go about 20 miles. It's that aerobic development that enables you ultimately to take whatever speed that you do have and maximize it. So, a friend of mine, Colleen Cannon, who was a triathlete way back in the early 80s, she said, you're not going to like what Phil's going to tell you. He's going to tell you to slow down, but just try it, stick with it and see what happens. And so I thought, well, I don't know everything there is about sports physiology and internal chemistry and energy systems and all that. So I'll just try it, what the heck. And so, like I said, I just trained aerobically for almost 2 months before I went into that race in Kauai. And I could see that I was getting faster as those months went by. And Phil explained it. He said, every time you go out and you do an aerobic training session, you stimulate your body to develop the enzymes that help break down fat for fuel, which eventually makes you a much more efficient fat burner. You can break down more stored fat per unit of time, which means that ultimately you can go faster at the same heart rate. So, I eventually got to where I could run aerobically and hold a 5-minute, 30-second mile, 5:30 pace, which was really quite fast, and so my heart rate was always lower than the other guys in the races, which meant that at any given pace we were going. So that just gave me more top end that I could tap into when it was important.
Yeah. So, Mike, you mentioned that obviously you had to slow down to get faster, but how did you feel like psychologically going into that race? You've done Phil Maffetone style for 2 months. Were you confident, or had you not proven to yourself that you were actually getting faster at this stage?
Oh, I had no confidence, by the time I got to the race, I think I was still only running I think I'd worked it down to about a 7-minute mile aerobically. I hadn't really done any speed work. I just did one speed session before the race just to kind of shock my system. But so, I had low expectations, to be honest, with that race in particular. I could see that my physiology was changing because I was getting faster at that same heart rate, 155 beats a minute or less. But I didn't know how that would translate in the race, because it was a half Ironman distance race, almost a half. So of course, it was definitely anaerobic. You're going really hard and going very fast. But I just felt like I had this engine that I had never developed before in that race. And so it was a very pleasant, shocking surprise to see the impact that even just 2 months of training like that had on my race performance.
Right. So, but what's interesting is that you still were nowhere near your best time, and yet you still performed.
Oh yeah. Like I said, I hadn't done my usual trash myself number of speed sessions to get ready, cycling, running, swimming. But I just had this deeper bank of energy that I could tap into in the race. And the other part was that I wasn't exhausting myself in my training. So I actually think part of it was that I showed up to that race more fresh than probably any other race that I had competed in to that point in my career. And that's also a big part, saving the best for your race, instead of using it up a little bit here, a little bit there every week throughout the year in your training.
Interesting. So you were very well tapered for the event.
Yeah.
So just obviously smart training was a massive change for you and proved beneficial. Was there anything else within this sort of smart training that changed for you in terms of perhaps sleep or diet or anything else?
Well, right about 1992, I was 34 years old, and that was the first year that I started to incorporate strength training into my program. I'd been able to get away without doing any strength work. And the reason that I didn't do any strength work is that I just had no idea what to do. I was never trained in it. I didn't have a mentor who was helping me with strength work. And so up until that point in my career, I was getting faster, but I could see at the end of 91 that I just wasn't quite as strong no matter how much I swam, biked, or ran. I could see that, my climbing on the hills was starting to get a little weaker. My recovery running wasn't quite as quick. I just didn't have the strength, upper body strength in the water that I was used to having. And so in 92, I was connected with a woman, Diane Bukta, who lived in San Diego, where I spent my winters. And she was like an encyclopedia of strength training. And she led me through an entire season of strength work. I started partway through 92, and then finally in 1993, we did a full season of it. And the change was dramatic. All of a sudden, I felt like I was 10 years younger, from one season to the next. You can kind of see it in a lot of the photos, I had muscle mass again, that had been slowly starting to diminish because of age. That was a huge piece. And what I was doing was just very, very traditional strength work, in the gym. There was, functional strength, core work it was just starting to get developed as I exited my racing years. And so, had I known back then what I know now, I think I would have raced even faster.
So what would you have done differently?
Oh, well, with the strength work, I would have incorporated more moves that are sort of functional oriented. So for an example, if you do a traditional squat, you've got that stable platform of both legs pushing up at the same time. But if you step up onto a bench with a weight, you're pushing up on one leg at a time. And that's functional because when you're running or cycling, you're pushing down with one leg at a time instead of both legs on that stable platform. So let's say your knee is wobbly or your foot isn't quite giving you a stable platform to push off of. You'll see that when you're stepping up onto a bench with a weight, as opposed to not seeing it when you have both feet planted firmly on the ground. So, there's a lot of, I think functional strength work is still kind of in its infancy because everybody's dreaming up a million different ways of lifting a weight, engaging a bunch of different muscles all at once and doing it with balance. But some of it's like overkill. So over time, I think you're going to really see how functional strength work can help not only endurance athletes, but especially people as they get older so that, they can keep walking and running as they get into their 50s and 60s and 70s, and they don't fall down because they have this functional movement where they're strong on the earth, just doing something as simple as getting up out of a chair or walking across the room or running, in the park or whatever it is.
So a lot of your strength training then ideally would be a lot of one-legged weights.
Yeah, I would incorporate an element of balance into as many moves as I could. And also, I've been messing around with sort of my own personal program of this that I do, that I'm kind of working on. And I'm seeing that the more muscles that I can engage in any one movement, it seems like the greater the overall stimulation to my body to get stronger is. And, that's not a new concept. For example, you do like a clean and jerk where you're using all your muscles to pull that thing up and up over your head and push up. That uses a lot of different muscles at the same time. It's a complicated move, but I'm developing some moves that you can do, simple program even in your home with a minimal amount of equipment, where you are tightening a lot of different muscles all at once, your glutes and your abs and your upper body and your back, so that everything is getting utilized at the same time, which I think I have been experiencing really just like super boosts the impact of strength work. For example, let's say you do you're doing a curl. Well, if you're sitting in a chair or on a bench or, in the gym, you're just isolating that one movement. You're only using your bicep, right? But if you do that same move, let's say with stretch cords and you're standing on one leg, you can engage your core, your abs, you can tighten your glutes. It just like supercharges every move that you do. It's really interesting. It's really fun to experiment with.
Absolutely. And so through Mark Allen Coaching for your triathlete clients and other athlete clients, do you write a strength and conditioning sort of program within that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of it. The majority of my clients are over, 35. So they're the ones who will get the biggest gains out of incorporating strength work into their swimming, cycling, and running training. And so they get a strength program for sure. It's got a couple different phases to it so that they sort of matches what they're doing on their swimming, cycling, and running as they get closer to their big races. But stay tuned. That's going to be modified shortly. And I think people are going to really love what I've been working on.
Wow. Are you potentially putting it out as a book or?
I will put it out there. I don't know if it'll be in a book. I don't know if it's that complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another, going back to one of your original questions there, how did I keep getting faster all those years? I kept things simple. It's my training that I did and the training that I give my athletes. It's not entertainment. It's training, and training is sort of doing the same things over and over and over and over so that you gain efficiency, but with just enough variation in the way that you are doing them so that your body keeps responding with fitness gains. And a lot of coaching now has gotten so complicated, people going out for, let's say, a 2-hour run, and they've got a certain period where they're doing a certain number of minutes in one zone and then another few more minutes in another zone and then back to the first zone. And it's like so complicated that, first of all, it occupies your mind too much. And that's another element, I can talk about in a moment, but it's important as an athlete to learn how to get your mind to actually be quiet, because that's the most impactful place that you can race from. And so every training session, there should be an element of getting your mind to be quiet while you're out there swimming, cycling, running. And the more complicated a workout is, the more your logical brain is trying to remember what it is you're supposed to do and how many minutes of this and how many minutes of that. You lose that essential part of training yourself to be in a champion's race mindset, which is quiet.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you say that, because sometimes you see people, they look like they've already done the workout before they start, just trying to get their head around what they're actually meant to do.
Yeah. An interval session on the track or in the pool, you have to know what it is and follow it. But your basic, just bread and butter workouts that you do day in and day out, those should be very, very simple.
Okay.
A certain amount of time in just a general training zone that you want to target within there. And, over the course of the workout, try to get a little bit faster as you go and staying within your range. That's simple. And then when it's simple like that, you take out the sort of that intellectual thinking process that you need to have engaged when you're following this very specific protocol. And when you do that, then you can also tune into how your body's actually moving.
So how else do you quieten the mind apart from having a simple program?
Make it a focus of what you do. There's probably almost every workout that's challenging. You're going to get to a point where, I know that I did. I always got to a point in certain key workouts that were challenging where I'd be going, this is too hard. It's too long. You're trying to come up with a million reasons why you should be able to back off. And those were just golden moments to just get myself to go, take that breath, calm it down, get my mind to be quiet. And then I'd be quiet for a few minutes. And then, the chatter would start up again. And then I'd have to go back and try and just say, okay, look around, see the hills that I'm riding in or the trails that I'm running on, get absorbed in that sort of natural environment and get myself to be quiet. And so, it's easy to sort of get yourself to be quiet if you're, sitting still. You're in a very quiet environment, maybe you're meditating or whatever. And that's good to start to get that experience of what it is like to be quiet. But the challenge or the key is to be able to translate in that and get into that space in a very chaotic, high energy environment like a race. It's not quiet in a race. There's chaos going on. There's, people pulling away that you thought you could stay with. There's something happening with your body you weren't planning on having going on. A million things going on out there. That's where if you can get yourself to be quiet, you're able to stay fully engaged and give everything you have, even if what you're giving is less than what you might be able to give on another day.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like your secret then, it has a lot of S's to it, but it sounds like smart training is a definite one. And you took us through that. And then obviously simple training in that, don't make it too hard. Strength obviously was something that you sort of even maybe wish you did more of. Steadying the mind, obviously within the training and potentially doing a bit of meditation outside of training. Was that something that you did?
Yeah. I mentioned the name Brant Secunda. Brant he's a spiritual teacher. He's a shaman from the Huichol Indian tradition in Mexico. The Indians live in central Mexico. He was led through a traditional apprenticeship by his grandfather to learn how to lead ceremonies, do healings, to teach that tradition. And a lot of the Huichol Indian tradition is based on, in very simple terms, developing a relationship with nature, being out in nature, feeling that connection to the sunrise and the sunset, taking time to, sit by a stream and just listen to that sound and let your troubles wash away. And a lot of the emphasis the Huichols have is on indeed learning how to quiet their mind so that, they say you can get the answers to the big questions in life when you are quiet. It's not when you're thinking about things or analyzing things that so many great insights come. It's when you're quiet, and I think probably every athlete who has trained outside knows this. You're troubled during the day or stressed and things are chaotic and you go out for a walk or a run and, 15 minutes into it, all of a sudden you realize you're not thinking about those things that were bothering you. You're just looking around and you see like that it's springtime and there's flowers and the sun is warm again. And, it's like your attitude changes, you shift. And then you're sort of more in I guess you'd say like a daydreamy state where thoughts might be coming, but they're not focused. You're not linearly trying to follow something. Your mind is just, it's very aware. It's actually heightened awareness.
Almost like a moving meditation.
Exactly. And that was what I really worked on, was that using my training as a practice to become quiet, as opposed to just training my body. It was also training my mind. And, for me, the easiest way to do that was to put myself in training environments that were very natural and beautiful. So I trained in San Diego in the wintertime, California, which I was right along the ocean, very beautiful, inspiring place to train. And then in the summers, I was out in Boulder, Colorado in the Rocky Mountains. And, that environment there just sparked me every day. I loved running the trails there in the mountains. I loved riding up to the high peaks. I loved even riding eastward on the flats and looking back and seeing the Rockies. It was just very inspiring. And in that inspiration, there was a peace. And with that peace came a quiet. And with that quiet came like a trust in what I was doing. And with that trust, then I was able to fine tune my training day to day to actually optimize it for what my kind of bigger goals were throughout the year and throughout my career.
Wow, you sound very different to a lot of athletes. It's more like almost like a job, whereas you're creating a picture of being in this wilderness and enjoying yourself and calmness, and it sounds quite different to what I typically hear of people training.
Well, I think that was part of what really enabled me to do what I did for so many years, because I did enjoy it, and it was my canvas where I learned a lot about life. In the training, in the racing, I learned a lot about life studying with Brant. I've studied with him now for 27, 28 years, and it's just a continual process. Like he said, in shamanism, you never graduate. It's a path for life. It's a way of learning and evolving throughout your life. And athletically, I kind of think of it as, I call it sort of like perfecting yourself, in the sense that each time you go out, you can either just do the same thing over and over and over, or you can go out and bring awareness to what you're doing and maybe move just a little bit differently, a little more efficiently. Maybe you find a way to get yourself to be quiet in a rough moment sooner. Maybe you find a way to change your biomechanics a little bit, let's say running or swimming, so that there's a little more efficiency or flow to it. Or maybe you're afraid of descending on the bike, and all of a sudden you feel this, something lets go, and then all of a sudden you can just feel how to corner, how to descend. It's like the university of life. You can learn anywhere you're at. And for me, that canvas for 15 years was in the sport of triathlon.
Yeah, right. And so was there anything else that you would attribute to your secret, I like to say, to your success?
Yeah, I was a great sleeper. A lot of athletes, they would get home at the end of the day after all their training, and they would be analyzing and processing and thinking about the day and then the next day. And it's like, when I got home from my training, I let it go. I was done. It's like, okay, did the work. Tomorrow I'll get up and I know what I have to do, but I'm not thinking about it yet. I'm not there. And I got great sleep. I slept easily 10 hours a night, almost every single night. A lot of days I would take a nap. I had the luxury of doing that because that's all I did. I didn't have a job that I was having to fit my training around. My training was my job. But sleeping is such a key to absorbing the training that you do. You can train all day long, but if you don't sleep well at night, your body doesn't recover quickly. And so I think just naturally, I'm a pretty good sleeper. And when I went to sleep, I absorbed my training probably better than most people, just because of that. It's a simple thing, but I know it was a key to what enabled me to do what I did.
I remember an interview you had with Brad Kearns, and he mentioned that I think he beat you in a race. I think it was like a Tuesday general race that everyone did, and it was it was because you hadn't had enough sleep that night, so you decided to sleep in and join everyone a bit later, and I like
that. Yeah, there was a Tuesday run in San Diego that happened every Tuesday, and it was a run on these horse trails that went through a little area called Rancho Santa Fe. Pretty hilly, but a great surface. They put wood chips on the trail, and so it was sort of like there could be anywhere from 50 to 100 people easily that would show up for this run, and it was hard. People would start out sort of conversational, but within the first 15 minutes, somebody would get the crowd going. And yeah, if you wanted a good workout, you go to the Tuesday run in Rancho Santa Fe.
But you made sure you had enough sleep before you did it.
Yes.
I like it.
Yes.
So sleep was obviously a big important. 10 hours of sleep is what a lot of doctors are recommending for athletes as well. So that was obviously another secret of yours. And what about nutrition? Was that a big factor, and did that change over time for you?
I think it was a pretty big factor, yes. Fortunately, I don't really like junk food so much, so I didn't eat much of it. I looked at what was popular at the time, in terms of diet for athletes and diet for health and all this. And, that changed every few years. what the doctors were saying or what somebody's latest thing was coming out saying that you should eat like. And most of it, I just kind of looked at it and go, that wouldn't work for me. And so, I ate very, I think, balanced in the sense that I wasn't afraid of fat. I loved avocados. I loved olive oil. I had a lot of that. I love beans, so I had a ton of hummus and pinto beans and all sorts of things like that still had their fiber intact. I loved like real green greens, not salad stuff, but more like, collard greens and things like that. So I ate a bunch of stuff like that now they're saying is very high nutrient density foods. And so I guess if I was to sum it up, that would kind of be how I would describe how I ate. I just ate a lot of high nutrient density foods, whether they were high concentration of carbohydrate, protein, or fat that were in good forms, or just the actual nutrients themselves, vitamins, minerals.
Okay.
It was very basic, I also didn't eat a ton compared to most triathletes. And I think part of it was that because almost everything I ate was high nutrient density, my body was getting what it needed with fewer calories than what the other guys were needing. If you eat stuff where a lot of the nutrient value has been stripped away, you might be getting the calories you need, but you're still going to be hungry because your body needs all these nutrients and it burns through a huge amount of them when you're doing it high volumes of training. The need for micronutrients goes up much quicker with high volumes of training than your need for calories goes up. So if you're not eating high nutrient density foods, you're going to be hungry all the time. You're going to overeat, and that's actually going to tire your body out because you're having to process way more calories than human beings are really set up to do on a daily basis.
So during your training or during your races, what did your nutrition look like there?
Oh, well, during the races, it just looked like everybody else. It was sport drinks and stuff that my body could absorb as quickly as it possibly could. Because it's, let's say in an Ironman, it's an energy equation. You're trying to figure out how fast you can go and still get carbohydrate calories in quick enough so that you can maintain that pace. And that gets very difficult to do after hour 5 or 6 of an Ironman, especially in the heat, like in Kona. Your digestive system is just shutting down. And so it's very hard to absorb carbohydrate calories quick enough to sustain a high output level. If we could absorb calories quicker, people would be going, 7.5 hours for an Ironman, 7:15, because fitness-wise, muscularly, we can do that, but we just can't get calories in quick enough over 7-hour, 8-hour day to sustain a high output level. So that sort of circles way back to that aerobic training that I was doing. Because I was really, really good at utilizing fat for fuel, I could sustain my Ironman pace and get a high percentage of the output energy that I needed from breaking down fat, so that I actually needed less carbohydrates to sustain that pace that I was holding, which meant that later in the race, I was still able to keep going fast compared to the other guys.
Right. Okay. And so even though you weren't used to eating like that in general, apart from in the race, you found that your body could absorb that sports drink and the gels and whatever else okay?
Yeah, okay. But I don't think, even if I had used that all the time, I don't think it would have made any difference on how I felt from it during the race. Human beings are meant to work. There was a T-shirt I saw a few years ago that said, I've never met a carbohydrate that I don't like. Human beings are just designed to like carbohydrates. There were a number of Ironmans though where I did get sick to my stomach, but that had nothing to do with the switch from what I ate on a day-to-day basis to taking in what I took in the races. It was just the fact that I had miscalculated the volume that I could actually absorb per hour and overdid it. And then everything started to back up, and then I started to get nauseous, and then sometimes I threw up, and it wasn't pretty, but I got the job done.
So on that note, that feeling of, I guess, really taking your body to the extreme, you mentioned that nowadays you have a fairly holistic approach to fitness, and that I remember in an interview you mentioned that you actually feel healthier now than you did when you were racing. And I guess when you're racing, you're right on the edge. You mentioned that you're one step away from injury or burnout. So do you think, I guess my question is, so at this elite level, are fitness and health mutually exclusive?
It depends on how long you try to sustain that level. For sure, they can be mutually exclusive. And like I said, the closer you are to absolutely optimizing the maximum capability of your genetics, the closer you are to being overtrained, burned out, getting injured, getting sick. It's a huge demand on your body to push to that extreme. You can do it once in a while, and once in a while actually makes you stronger. But to try to stay there at that absolute peak level year after year after year for long periods of time over the year, it really puts a huge demand on your body that will take time to put back and replace not only the energy that you expend, but also the nutrients that you're using up. They've done some studies on long distance runners where they've done autopsies on folks who have run at fairly good levels for years. And they found that after they died, that they look like people who were very severely malnourished because, the demand they put on their bodies was so high, but the food wasn't putting it back. And so they were just depleting themselves over time. It's a catch, for a period of time, certain periods of the year. Yeah, you can get right up there, but you also have to honor yourself, which is another key in our book, Fit Soul Fit Body, is honor yourself, meaning take time to put the energy back, take time to put the nutrients back. Don't make it a mantra to try and do speed work every week of the year. Take an off season where you are just exercising because it feels good to move as opposed to trying to reach a peak personal level of fitness. Yeah, life fitness is much different than peak performance for sure.
And I guess also that trick that you shared with us earlier, that 2.5 months off that you had versus everyone else having, a couple of weeks off and limiting your races and having that overall year plan that is just a little bit smarter than maybe the average athlete.
Yeah, a lot of guys would finish Kona in October and then Ironman in October, and then 3 weeks later they're thinking, I'm going to get a jump up on the season, and by mid-November they're starting to train again, and by middle of December they're actually in really good shape, and by January 1st they're really going strong. I would start back training after the first of the year, and the first month was really challenging because I was so far behind all of those other guys. But by the time we hit June, I was really starting to get my stride, and those guys had already peaked. And then by late August, when we're doing our real Ironman training for that year's October race, I could see that, I was still going on my fitness improvements, and those guys had already passed their peak and they were just barely hanging on. And then it played out in the races too.
So how did you know it was time to retire?
I just knew, as an athlete, there were kind of, different methods of sort of different things I wanted to do to tweak my training program to keep improving year after year. And in 1995, as I was getting ready for my final Ironman, I knew that no matter how the race turned out, that was going to be the best I would ever be able to prepare for it. I just did everything that I had always wanted to do all those years and put it into that one race. And so I knew that win, lose, or draw, that was going to be the best performance I could ever put out at the Ironman. And so I knew there was no reason for me to go back after that. That was sort of my quest to put out my best and then move on. I had seen other athletes training in Boulder. I'd seen runners and cyclists and other triathletes who had raced too many years and their bodies start to break down. And then all of a sudden they're injured and then they're forced out of the sport. And then they can't even enjoy exercising just normally on a day-to-day level because, their bodies are trashed. And I thought, I want to leave the sport healthy, uninjured, and not burned out. That was a driving vision that I had and something that I was always tuning into. And so the last year I did Ironman, going into it before the race even started, I knew that was it. This was it. This was the best I could bring. I'm healthy. I'm not injured. I'm not burned out. And it's time to move on. I was lucky. I was really lucky.
And was it easy to move on? You mentioned that you wanted to be in a position where you could continue with fitness, and obviously that's what you did. But without that competitiveness or that challenge, I guess, was it difficult to leave that behind you?
Not at all, actually. I think part of the reason is that I didn't thrive on the competitiveness of the sport. That's almost something that I put up with because you had to. I loved the training. I loved seeing what I could do with my body as I evolved my fitness. And, there's a real flow that happens when you really get into that great training state where just everything moves and it flows, and you've got this speed or this strength or this endurance that just is there, and it's really satisfying. And so that's what really excited me about the sport. But then that's something that I can continue with now. I surf a lot now. I did that as a kid, and I live in Santa Cruz, 2 blocks from one of the main surf breaks. And so, I'm not the best guy out there. I never have been. I never will. But on a personal level, I can always go out there and find something that is just a little bit different than I've ever been able to do before. And it's really fun. It's really satisfying. It's movement. It's being out in the ocean. I'm in nature. It's cardio. It's my yoga because you're moving your body in every different direction. It's time hanging out with that community of friends that you get to know out there. And it's a combination of a lot of things. It's also my time to just let my mind be quiet and kind of look out and daydream. They've done research, and they've shown that when you're daydreaming, your creative problem-solving part of your brain is actually working at its peak, much more than when you're actually focusing on a specific problem. Einstein said that some of his greatest insights came when he was riding a bicycle. So I think that, attests to how valuable it is for people to move and to be outside and to let your mind be quiet. And when you do that, amazing thoughts can come, or insights, or just peace. And that's priceless.
I love that passion that you hold. A lot of people, I guess, they burn out, and then they never want to get on the bike again. They never want to do anything to do with fitness or health. And you're just an inspiration, quite the opposite. And I know our listeners can check out Fit Soul, Fit Bodies, and the book that you wrote. And also, I'm assuming that you have potentially a couple of spots available if people are looking for an online coach.
Oh, yeah, MarkAllenCoaching.com for all of my coaching that I have. I will be relaunching the website probably in about 2 weeks, between a week and 2 weeks. And I'm retelling a lot of the stories from my career and putting those on the website, and telling a lot of insights into what was going on with me through all of my years racing in Kona, that stories that I've actually never told a lot of. So,
excellent.
Take a look at that. And then, Brant's website is shamanism.com. He holds retreats all over the world. He and I just taught a Fit Soul, Fit Body workshop in Massachusetts last Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And people love it because it's what we're all made of. We all have a body, and we all have emotions, and we all have, this passion and vision, and we all connect with nature when we're out in it, So this just gives structure to how you can do that to become a better athlete, to improve your mindset, to let go of negative emotions like fear or anger or jealousy, to how you can lose weight, just simple stuff that is common to all of us.
Excellent. And Mark, you run those annually, those workshops?
Yeah, we usually do a couple a year. I think the next one that we have on the calendar is going to be in May next year out here at a new retreat center that's just opening up. It's called 1440, the number 1440. And they're targeting a lot of the Silicon Valley folks to come over the coastal mountains and just have a getaway for a few days.
Excellent. Well, we'll link to all of that in the show notes. But before I let you go, Mark, I've just got to ask you something quite random, nothing to do with exercise. Well, potentially. Do you have a tattoo?
Yeah, I do not have a tattoo.
Why not?
I just look at it this way. There's not one piece of clothing that I wore 20 years ago that I still want to be wearing. So I'm thinking, what could I possibly put on my skin that 20 years from now I'm going to go, oh, yeah, I'm glad I still have that.
I love that. So gun to the head, what would you choose?
Oh, geez. If I was going to have anything, I don't know. I actually like some of the Polynesian designs. Those are the tattoos that I see, like when I'm in Hawaii, or I was in Tahiti at an Xterra race a number of years ago, and some of the tattoos of the folks there, I love those tattoos, the Polynesian designs. Probably something like that if I really was going to get one.
Excellent. Look, thank you very much for your time, Mark. I'm sure our listeners absolutely loved hearing from you, and we'll keep an eye out on your website for some updates, and maybe even let us know when you release something to do with your strength program.
I will. Look forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Allie.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ally.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.